Do you remember Rue McClanahan? To millions of viewers, she'll always be Blanche Devereaux, the sharp-tongued Southern belle from the Golden Girls who never met a compliment she didn't enjoy. But off-screen, her own love story was far messier, far funnier, and far more heartbreaking than anything her character ever went through on television. She walked down the aisle again and again, chasing something that always seemed to slip through her fingers, right up until the very end of her life, through fear, heartbreak, and at least one marriage that turned out to be far more frightening than funny. Stick around, because the real story behind those marriages is stranger than anything you've heard. Setting the record straight. Before we go any further, it's worth pausing on the number in the title, because it's one of the most repeated pieces of misinformation about her entire life. Rue McClanahan is often described online as having been married 8 times, but that number doesn't actually hold up against the record. She herself addressed this in her own memoir, titled With Tongue Firmly in Cheek, My First 5 Husbands. And the Ones Who Got Away, written after her 5th marriage had ended and before she found her 6th and final husband. Adding that 6th marriage to the 5 described in her book brings her total to 6 husbands across her lifetime, not 8. It's an understandable mix-up, since the exact number floating around the internet varies depending on the source, and celebrity trivia has a funny way of getting exaggerated and repeated so many times that the inflated version eventually starts to feel more true than the actual record. But 6 marriages is what the historical record, her own obituaries, and her own memoir all confirm, consistent across newspaper archives, biographical encyclopedias, and interviews she gave throughout her life. And honestly, 6 is more than enough drama to fill an entire hour of television, let alone one woman's real life. So let's start from the beginning, back before any of the husbands, back in a small town in Oklahoma, where a spirited young girl was already dreaming of something bigger than the life laid out in front of her. A girl from Oklahoma with big dreams. She was born Eddie Rue McClanahan on February 21st, 1934, in the small town of Healdton, Oklahoma, to a building contractor father and a beautician mother. From a young age, she showed an unmistakable spark, the kind of personality that made people notice her the moment she walked into a room, and it wasn't long before that spark found its outlet on the stage. She went on to attend the University of Tulsa, where she graduated with honors, majoring in both German and theatre, an unusual academic pairing that hinted at just how sharp and disciplined her mind really was, beneath the bubbly persona she would later become famous for. Growing up in a small Oklahoma town gave her a grounded, folksy sense of humor that never really left her, even decades later when she was rubbing shoulders with some of the biggest names in Hollywood. She often spoke fondly of her upbringing, describing a childhood filled with big personalities and colorful characters, the kind of Southern storytelling tradition that clearly shaped the way she would later approach both comedy and her own writing. That small-town foundation gave her an unusual kind of confidence, a sense that she belonged wherever she decided to go, even when that meant leaving everything familiar behind for a city that chewed up and spat out far more dreamers than it ever made stars. It's a quality that would serve her well, not just in her career, but through every single relationship that lay ahead of her. A persistent, almost stubborn optimism that refused to let repeated disappointment change who she fundamentally was underneath it all. In 1957, with barely enough money to survive more than a couple of weeks, Rue packed up and moved to New York City to chase a career in acting. It was a bold move for a young woman from small-town Oklahoma, arriving in one of the most competitive cities in the world with little more than ambition and talent to rely on. She talked her way into a class taught by the legendary acting coach Uta Hagen, and slowly, steadily, she began working her way up through the New York theater scene, taking whatever roles she could find, while the city around her buzzed with the cultural changes of the late 1950s and early 1960s. It was during this early, uncertain chapter of her life, while she was still finding her footing as a performer, that she also began finding and losing husbands at a pace that would define the next several decades of her personal life. Her very first marriage came quickly, and it came from within the very same theatre world she was just beginning to break into. The first husband, and a fast start to motherhood. Her first husband was a fellow stage actor named Tom Bish. The two met while working within the same New York theatre circles, and their romance moved quickly, culminating in marriage in 1958. Almost immediately, the young couple welcomed a son together, a boy named Mark, born on October 2nd, 1958, in Ardmore, Oklahoma. For Rue, motherhood arrived just as her acting career was still taking its first tentative steps, a combination that would have been overwhelming for anyone, let alone a woman barely in her mid-20s trying to establish herself in one of the most demanding professions in the world. Unfortunately, the marriage to Bish did not last. The couple divorced in 1959, just a year after they had wed, leaving Rue as a young single mother navigating the unpredictable world of New York theatre with an infant son to care for. It was an incredibly difficult position to be in, and by many accounts, those early years were a genuine struggle, balancing auditions and rehearsals with the responsibilities of raising Mark largely on her own. Despite the divorce, Rue and Bish reportedly maintained a workable relationship in the years that followed, one focused on their shared responsibility for their son, even as their romantic partnership had run its course almost as quickly as it had begun. Despite everything, she never wavered in her determination to keep pursuing her craft, and it was during this period of instability that she made a decision that would complicate her life even further, one rooted less in romance and more in a desperate search for stability and a father figure for her young son. A rushed second marriage and an unexpected complication. Even before her divorce from Tom Bish had been fully finalized, Rue found herself drawn to her close friend, a man named Norman Hartweg. He represented something different from Bish, a sense of freedom and possibility, someone who seemed to understand her restless, creative spirit in a way she hadn't experienced before. Eager for stability and a partner to help raise Mark, she married Hartweg in 1959, moving forward with the relationship, despite the fact that her paperwork from her first marriage had not yet been fully settled. That timing created an awkward legal complication that Rue herself later openly acknowledged, technically making her a bigamist for a brief window of time, married to two men simultaneously due to the overlap in the legal proceedings. It wasn't the kind of scandal that made national headlines, since she wasn't yet the famous face she would later become, but it was a telling early sign of just how quickly and impulsively she tended to leap into marriage during this chaotic chapter of her 20s. Looking back on this period later in life, Rue was remarkably candid about how little thought she had put into some of these early decisions, admitting that the search for security for herself and her young son sometimes outpaced her better judgment. The relationship with Hartweg, much like her first marriage, struggled to find lasting footing. By 1961, Rue had come to the realization that this second marriage wasn't the answer to the stability she was searching for either, and the couple divorced, closing out yet another short chapter in her ongoing search for lasting partnership. Not long after, she packed up once again, this time heading west to California, hoping that a change of scenery might finally bring the stability that New York and two failed marriages hadn't managed to provide. It was a decision that would ultimately reshape the entire trajectory of her career, even if her personal life was about to take an even darker turn before things eventually started looking up. The marriage that turned frightening. It was in the years that followed her move west that Rue met the man who would become her third husband, an actor named Peter DeMaio. The two married in 1964, and on paper, this relationship represented her longest and most stable partnership up to that point, lasting roughly 7 years before finally ending in divorce in 1971. But the length of the marriage did not mean it was a happy or healthy one. In fact, by Rue's own later accounts, it turned out to be one of the most difficult and unsettling relationships of her entire life. According to what she later shared publicly, DeMaio had a hot temper unlike anyone she had ever encountered before, and she admitted candidly that she became genuinely afraid of him during parts of their marriage. She would later describe him as the most volatile person she had ever known personally, someone whose moods could shift without warning and leave the entire household on edge. It wasn't just Rue who felt the strain of his temperament either. Her young son, Mark, reportedly struggled to have a healthy relationship with his stepfather during this period, and the tension within the household became difficult for everyone involved, turning what should have been a stable, secure home environment for a growing boy into something far more unpredictable. The situation grew serious enough that when Rue eventually sought outside guidance, the counselor she consulted gave her a piece of advice unlike anything the professional had ever told a client before, urging her directly and unequivocally that this was not a relationship she should continue. It was a striking moment, a trained professional stepping outside the usual boundaries of gentle, open-ended guidance to instead deliver a direct and urgent warning, a detail that speaks volumes about just how serious the situation inside that marriage had actually become. It's a sobering piece of her story, one that stands in sharp contrast to the glamorous, comedic image most people associate with her decades later on television. Behind the bright lights and the eventual laughter of primetime sitcoms, there was a young woman navigating a genuinely difficult and unsettling home life, trying to protect both herself and her son, while still chasing the acting career she had sacrificed so much to build. Eventually, after years of strain, the marriage to DeMaio ended in 1971, freeing Rue from what had become an increasingly unhealthy situation, right around the same time that her professional career was finally about to take a dramatic turn for the better. A career finally catching fire. Throughout these turbulent personal years, Rue never stopped working. She made her Broadway debut in 1969, starring alongside Dustin Hoffman in the musical Jimmy Shine, a milestone that marked her arrival as a serious and respected New York stage performer after more than a decade of grinding through smaller roles. The following year, she landed a breakout part on the daytime soap opera Another World, playing a memorably unhinged nanny, a role that gave television audiences their first real taste of her ability to blend charm with a wicked comic edge. It was television producer Norman Lear who truly changed the trajectory of her career. He cast her in a guest appearance on All in the Family in 1971, and audiences responded so strongly to her performance that Lear soon brought her onto the spin-off series Maude, where she played Vivian, the flirtatious best friend and neighbor to B. Arthur's title character. The role ran from 1972 through 1978, giving Rue years of steady, high-profile television work and, perhaps just as importantly, forging a genuine friendship with B. Arthur that would carry forward more than a decade later into an entirely different, far more iconic show. Those years on Maude gave Rue something she had rarely experienced up to that point in her adult life, a genuine sense of professional stability. For the first time since arriving in New York over a decade earlier with barely 2 weeks of money in her pocket, she had a steady paycheck, a recognizable face, and a place within one of the most successful television franchises of the era. It was a striking contrast to the chaos of her personal life during those same years, and by many accounts, her work became something of a steady anchor amid the repeated upheaval of her marriages and divorces. Colleagues from this period often described her as endlessly professional and hard-working on set, someone who brought genuine discipline to her craft, regardless of whatever turmoil might have been happening in her personal life away from the cameras. In the years following Maud, Rue continued building a reputation as one of television's most reliable comedic performers, taking on a role as Aunt Fran on the series Mama's Family, alongside Vicki Lawrence and Betty White from 1982 to 1984. It was a period of genuine professional momentum for her, even as her personal life continued its familiar, unpredictable pattern. That stretch on Mama's Family also marked her first time working alongside Betty White, a professional pairing that would eventually prove far more significant than either woman likely realized at the time, laying early groundwork for a friendship that would carry them both through the biggest success of their careers just a few years later. Just as her career was gaining serious steam, she found herself walking down the aisle once again, this time with a man whose profession could not have been further removed from the entertainment industry she had spent decades building a life within. Husband number 4, and a long-awaited stretch of stability. Her fourth husband was a man named Gus Fisher. The two began dating in November of 1975 and married on November 6, 1976, entering a relationship that, compared to her earlier whirlwind romances, actually managed to last for a meaningful stretch of time. For nearly 5 years, Rue and Fisher remained married, making it, at that point, one of the more stable partnerships of her adult life, even if it ultimately couldn't survive the long term either. Fisher operated largely outside the entertainment industry, which by some accounts gave Rue a welcome sense of normalcy during those years, a relationship grounded a little further away from the pressures and instability of show business that had shaped so much of her adult life up to that point. For a woman who had spent nearly 2 decades either working her way up through New York theatre or navigating turbulent early marriages, those relatively quiet years with Fisher offered something close to an ordinary domestic life, even if that ordinary life ultimately proved just as fragile as the marriages that came before it. The couple divorced on August 4th, 1981, bringing an end to what had been, relatively speaking, one of the calmer chapters in her long romantic history. By this point in her life, Rue had already been married and divorced 4 times, a pattern that would have discouraged plenty of people from ever trying again. But if there was one consistent thread running through her entire personal life, it was an unshakable belief in the idea of lasting love, even after every previous attempt had fallen short. She once reflected candidly that she had always expected to be married only once, and forever, a hope that, despite mounting evidence to the contrary, she simply refused to let go of. That persistence would soon lead her into her 5th marriage, one that arrived just as her career was about to reach its absolute peak. A whirlwind 5th marriage at the worst possible time. In 1984, Rue reconnected with a man named Tom Keel, a race car driver she had actually known years earlier as a high school boyfriend back in Oklahoma. There was an undeniable pull toward familiarity and trust in reconnecting with someone from her past, someone who represented a simpler, earlier chapter of her life before Hollywood, before failed marriages, before the pressures of fame had complicated everything. The two fell into a relationship quickly, and by 1985 they were married, moving forward with a decision that, by Rue's own later admission, was made in far too much haste. She later reflected that she had been looking for someone she could genuinely trust, and that the shared history and comfort of an old high school romance had made the decision to marry again feel far less risky than it actually turned out to be. The timing could hardly have been more dramatic. That very same year, Rue landed the role that would define the rest of her career and cement her place in television history, Blanche Devereaux on The Golden Girls, which premiered in 1985 and shot straight to the top of the ratings. Just as her professional life was reaching unprecedented heights, her marriage to Keel was quietly falling apart behind the scenes. The relationship lasted barely a year before ending in a particularly messy and expensive divorce in 1986, made worse by the fact that Rue had refused to sign a prenuptial agreement before the wedding, a decision that ended up costing her a substantial financial settlement when the marriage collapsed. It was, by nearly every account, one of the more painful lessons of her personal life, unfolding at almost the exact same moment the entire country was falling in love with her on screen. While millions of viewers each week watched Blanche Devereaux confidently navigate romance with wit and charm, the woman playing her was quietly working through the fallout of her fifth failed marriage, a jarring split between her public and private realities that few people watching at home could have ever guessed was happening. It's a striking piece of irony that stuck with her for years afterward. The idea that America's most confident television seductress was, behind the scenes, still searching for the same lasting stability that had eluded her through 4 previous marriages. Becoming a Golden Girl. The Golden Girls turned Rue McClanahan into a household name almost overnight. Alongside Bea Arthur, Betty White, and Estelle Getty, she helped create one of the most beloved ensembles in television history, playing a character whose confident embrace of romance and sexuality, even in her 60s, felt genuinely groundbreaking for its era. Blanche Devereaux always referred to her late father as Big Daddy, delivered her flirtatious lines with impeccable comic timing, and quickly became a fan favorite, earning Rue an Emmy Award for her performance in 1987. Rue herself often spoke about what made Blanche such a special character to play, describing her as a woman who loved life and loved men, but who also carried a certain insecurity beneath all that outward confidence, a complexity that Rue worked hard to bring to every performance rather than playing the role as a simple, one-note caricature. That layered approach to comedy, finding the real, relatable vulnerability underneath the jokes, was part of what made her performance resonate so deeply with audiences week after week. And it's a big part of why the character has remained so fondly remembered decades after the show first went off the air. Given everything she had personally lived through by the time she landed the role, 5 marriages, a frightening relationship, and years of searching for stability, it's hard not to wonder how much of Blanche's hopeful, unsinkable pursuit of romance was drawn directly from Rue's own real-life experience. A life imitating art, or perhaps more accurately, art quietly imitating a life still very much in progress. The show ran for 7 seasons, from 1985 to 1992, and became a genuine cultural phenomenon, debuting at number 1 in the ratings and remaining a fixture in the top 10 for the majority of its run. Behind the scenes, the 4 lead actresses developed a close, genuine friendship that extended well beyond the soundstage, spending time together outside of work and remaining loyal to one another through the ups and downs of their individual careers in the years that followed. That friendship became especially meaningful to Rue later in life, as she watched, one by one, her closest castmates and dearest friends pass away in the years leading up to her own death. When the series finally ended, Rue continued working alongside Betty White and Estelle Getty on the short-lived spin-off series The Golden Palace, extending the world of these characters just a little bit longer before eventually moving on to other projects. Throughout the years that followed, she remained a beloved and instantly recognizable presence in American entertainment, taking on a wide range of guest roles across shows, including The Love Boat, Lou Grant, Newhart, Murder, She Wrote, Murphy Brown, and Touched by an Angel, proving that her talent and appeal extended far beyond the single iconic role that had made her famous, even as Blanche Devereaux remained, for most audiences, inseparable from her public identity for the rest of her life. She often joked in later interviews that she couldn't walk through an airport or a grocery store without someone calling out to her using Blanche's name instead of her own, a small but telling sign of just how completely the character had come to define her public identity, for better and occasionally for worse. But behind the professional triumph of those years, Rue's personal life had, for the first time in decades, settled into something resembling quiet. After the painful ending of her fifth marriage, she spent over a decade without remarrying, a notably long stretch for a woman who had walked down the aisle 5 times across roughly 3 decades. It would take over 10 years before she found herself standing at the altar one final time, with a man she would later describe as the truest partner she had ever found. Finding something that finally lasted. Her sixth and final husband was an actor named Morrow Wilson. The couple married in 1997, more than a decade after her fifth marriage had ended, and this time, something felt genuinely different. Rue and Wilson's relationship became, by a wide margin, the longest and most enduring of her entire life, lasting 12 years, far surpassing any of her previous 5 marriages, combined in terms of stability and longevity. Friends and colleagues who knew the couple often described their bond as a genuine, easy partnership, one built on mutual respect and companionship, rather than the whirlwind haste that had characterized so many of her earlier relationships. By the time she married Wilson, Rue was in her early 60s, an established television icon with decades of hard-won experience and, by her own account, a much clearer sense of exactly what she needed from a partner than the young, hopeful actress who had rushed into her first marriage back in 1958. That perspective seemed to make all the difference. Rather than the rushed courtships that had defined so many of her earlier relationships, her connection with Wilson developed with a patience and steadiness that had never quite been present before, built on years of shared experience within the same theatrical world they both called home. It was, in many ways, the exact opposite approach from the one that had led her into 5 previous marriages, and it turned out to be the one that finally worked. In 2007, Rue published her candid and famously funny memoir, My First 5 Husbands, and the Ones Who Got Away, chronicling her journey through love, marriage, and everything in between, with the same sharp wit that had made Blanche Devereaux such a beloved character. The book became a genuine hit, praised for its honesty and its refusal to sugarcoat the messier chapters of her life, offering readers a warmly funny yet remarkably candid look at decades of romantic missteps, mixed in with plenty of stories from her extraordinary career on stage and screen. She reportedly wrote much of it herself, rather than leaning heavily on a ghostwriter, insisting on capturing her own distinctive voice and comic timing on the page, the same way she had always brought it to a live audience or a soundstage. Interestingly, despite the book focusing so heavily on her romantic history, Wilson reportedly chose not to read it himself, a small but telling detail about a marriage that seemed to thrive on trust and a certain degree of comfortable independence between 2 people who had both been through enough relationships to know exactly what they valued in each other. Even this relationship, however, was not without its complications in the final chapter. In 2009, Rue and Wilson legally separated, though the two never proceeded with a formal divorce, and by most accounts, their bond remained close and caring even after the separation. Following her eventual passing, Wilson spoke publicly and emotionally about their relationship, describing a depth of love for her unlike anything he had experienced with anyone else in his life. Whatever complications existed between them in those final years, the 12 years they spent together still stood as by far the longest and most meaningful chapter in her entire romantic history, proof that her decades-long search for something lasting had eventually, finally, paid off. The final years. Even as her personal life found its most stable footing yet, Rue's health began presenting new and serious challenges as she moved into her 60s and 70s. In June of 1997, she was diagnosed with breast cancer, undergoing a lumpectomy followed by 5 months of chemotherapy treatment. She came through that health battle successfully, and in the years that followed, she became a passionate and outspoken advocate for other women facing similar diagnoses, giving a series of lectures for breast cancer support groups under the fitting title Aging Gracefully, drawing on her own experience to offer comfort and encouragement to others walking the same difficult road. That willingness to speak openly about her own health struggles became something of a hallmark of her later years, part of a broader pattern of honesty that had already defined her memoir and her public persona more generally. Rather than retreating from public life as she aged, she seemed to lean further into using her platform for causes she genuinely cared about, whether that meant breast cancer awareness, animal welfare, or advocacy connected to the LGBTQ community, treating her fame less as a shield to protect and more as a tool to actually help people. She was known among friends for personally fostering and rehoming animals in need, often taking in older or harder-to-place pets that shelters struggled to find homes for. A small but consistent act of kindness that ran quietly alongside her much more public advocacy work throughout these later decades of her life. She continued working steadily through the 2000s, taking on stage roles and guest television appearances well into her 70s, including a memorable turn on the series Sordid Lives, where she continued to display the same fearless comedic energy that had defined her entire career, even while recovering from a knee surgery during filming. Rue had also become a beloved figure within the LGBTQ community over the years, embraced as something of a gay icon thanks to her outspoken advocacy and her larger-than-life screen persona. And she remained deeply engaged in causes related to animal welfare throughout this period of her life as well, sharing her homes with a rotating menagerie of rescued cats and dogs, sometimes as many as a dozen animals living under her roof at any given time. In the fall of 2009, plans were underway for a gala tribute in San Francisco to celebrate Rue's remarkable career, but the event had to be postponed when she was suddenly hospitalized. During that hospital stay, doctors determined she needed triple bypass heart surgery, a serious procedure that she underwent and, remarkably, initially seemed to recover from reasonably well. Not long afterward, however, she suffered a stroke, a significant setback that required around-the-clock nursing care and speech therapy as she worked to regain her strength in the months that followed. For a woman who had spent her entire career known for her sharp wit and quick delivery, the process of relearning speech and rebuilding her strength was, by every account, an especially difficult and humbling ordeal, one she faced with the same determination that had carried her through decades of professional and personal setbacks before it. A final goodbye. Despite the seriousness of her health struggles throughout late 2009 and into 2010, there had been genuine hope among her friends and family that Rue was continuing to make progress. Tragically, that recovery would not last. On June 3, 2010, Rue McClanahan died at New York Presbyterian Hospital in New York City following a severe brain hemorrhage, passing away at the age of 76. Her son, Mark, was the one who ultimately made the difficult decision to take his mother off life support. A heartbreaking final chapter for a man who had been by her side since the very earliest and most uncertain years of her adult life, back when she was a young, struggling actress, raising him almost entirely on her own. It was a devastating, full-circle moment in many ways. The son whose birth had coincided with her very first, short-lived marriage, and who had lived through so many of her subsequent marriages and divorces as a child and young man, ultimately becoming the one who had to make the final, most difficult decision of her life on her behalf. Morrow Wilson, though legally separated from Rue at the time of her death, remained close to the family throughout this period and spoke publicly afterward about the depth of the love they had shared, a testament to just how genuine and lasting their bond had remained even after their formal separation 2 years earlier. Her death made her the third member of the beloved Golden Girls cast to pass away, following Estelle Getty in 2008 and Bea Arthur in April of 2009, leaving Betty White as the sole surviving member of the iconic ensemble. Betty spoke movingly about the loss in the days that followed, describing the depth of affection and friendship the two women had shared over so many years working together, and noting just how much it hurt to lose yet another member of a cast that had become something like a second family over the decades since the show first premiered. No formal funeral service was held for Rue, and instead, her family created a memorial page to allow friends and fans from around the world to share their own memories, while separate memorial gatherings were later held in both New York and Los Angeles during the summer following her passing, giving the many different communities she had touched throughout her long career the chance to properly say goodbye. The legacy she left behind. Looking back across the entirety of her personal life, Rue McClanahan's story reads almost like its own kind of sitcom, filled with fast romances, painful lessons, moments of real fear, and eventually a hard-won stretch of stability that took her decades and 5 previous marriages to finally find. She was remarkably open about her own history in a way that few celebrities of her generation ever were, writing candidly and often with genuine humor about relationships that, in hindsight, ranged from simply unlucky to genuinely troubling, all without ever losing the underlying warmth and resilience that defined her both on screen and off. It's worth remembering just how unusual that kind of openness was for a woman of her generation and stature. Many actresses of her era spent their careers carefully managing their public image, revealing as little as possible about the messier corners of their private lives. Rue took the opposite approach entirely, treating her own romantic history as material worth sharing rather than a source of shame to hide. And in doing so, she gave audiences a far more complete and human picture of who she really was than most celebrity memoirs of the era ever attempted. Choosing candor over carefully managed mystique at a stage in her career when she had every reason and every opportunity to simply let her legacy rest quietly on Blanche Devereaux alone. What made her story resonate with so many people, especially in the years since her passing, wasn't the number of husbands she had, whether that number gets remembered correctly as 6 or inflated into the exaggerated 8 so often repeated online. It was her refusal to stop believing that lasting love was still possible, even after disappointment, and her willingness to laugh at her own history rather than hide from it. She turned decades of personal heartbreak into one of the most entertaining memoirs ever written by a television star, finding humor and hard-earned wisdom in a romantic history that most people would have preferred to keep quietly buried. Fans continue discovering her story today, often through clips and retrospectives celebrating her work on the Golden Girls, and many are genuinely surprised to learn just how much real, lived experience sat behind the confident, playful character she brought to life every week. There's something almost poetic about the fact that a woman who spent so many years searching for lasting love on her own terms ended up playing a character who embodied exactly that same unapologetic pursuit of romance, bringing decades of hard-won personal wisdom to a role that resonated with millions of viewers precisely because it felt so genuinely lived in. Today, fans who grew up watching her light up the screen as Blanche Devereaux may be surprised to learn just how much genuine struggle sat behind that confident, flirtatious character. The fear she once felt in an unhealthy marriage, the exhausting cycle of hope and heartbreak that repeated itself again and again, and the quiet relief of finally finding, in her 60s, a partnership that actually lasted. It's a reminder that even the most beloved and seemingly larger-than-life television stars carried real, complicated lives behind the laughter they gave to millions of viewers every single week, and that Rue McClanahan's greatest performance may not have been on any stage or screen at all, but in the sheer determination she showed simply getting back up again and again, every single time love let her down. If you enjoyed this video, please like and subscribe to our channel so you never miss out on more fascinating stories.